You're listening to Alamo City Limits Podcast with Noah Magaro-George, the official San Antonio Spurs podcast of Pounding the Rock in SB Nation.
What's going on, San Antonio Spurs fans? Welcome back to Alamo City Limits, the official San Antonio Spurs podcast of SB Nation and Pounding the Rock. Today, we're going to be talking about Team USA and the future of San Antonio Spurs basketball. I've got a very special guest, founder of B-Ball Index, Tim, a.k.a. Cranjis McBasketball. How you doing today, Tim?
Hey, I'm doing much better now that the Team USA is winning. Happy to be here, and thank you for having me, Noah.
Of course, I'm excited to talk to you, and let's just hop into the first topic, Team USA basketball. Now, there was a ton of criticism heaped on to head coach Gregg Popovich after those first couple losses to Nigeria, to Australia. You know, Stephen A. Smith said that he has a spotty record since Kawhi. That's a little bit undebatable. Kendrick Perkins says that he's arrogant. He's being outcoached. I don't really agree with that. And it seems like a lot of people are sort of using this as an opportunity to sort of heap on criticism of Gregg Popovich. And I want to get your opinion. So what do you think has gone wrong for this historically dominant international basketball program? And I do realize they won their last game against Argentina. And sort of, you know, how much blame should we place on Gregg Popovich? How much blame should we place on the players?
I think it's a little bit of both, but even more so just the situation. This is a team with a bunch of new players that haven't really played together. There's a lack of practice happening. We're seeing, and we saw it from game 1 to game 2 to this last game, them adjusting to the whistle. The way the NBA is called is a good bit different from how we're seeing these games called. We're seeing guys expecting touch fouls and, you know, one dribble, you touch me, I'm going to pull right up and try to get my shot off as quickly as possible. So it counts in the continuation, but in these games, they're not calling it at all. So those just end up being bad shots. Or we're seeing the Team USA not take advantage of rules like the goaltending rule and being able to bat balls off of the rim. We haven't really seen much of that at all, whereas other teams are winning those little margins. And that's just part of adjusting to the game. And there are, I mean, certainly NBA players on other teams, but this is a USA roster constructed pretty much of only NBA players. So it's very new for everybody versus new for a couple guys on other teams. And a lot of those international players played overseas before coming to the NBA. So it may not be completely new to them. So I think that's part of it. I think the roster construction itself is a little bit to blame. There's not much point of attack defense on this team. We have some really, star-studded offensive players. Defensively, you've got some guys here and there, but, Bradley Beal, Dame Lillard isn't the defensive backcourt that you'd like to throw out there at all times. So that can be trouble. And then in general with basketball construction, and we'll talk about this later, different players have different jobs on offense. And a lot of the jobs that these players for the NBA that are going on this Team USA team are all shot creators. They're all used to having the ball in their hands. And, we hear it thrown out all the time. Oh, there's only one ball. This is one of those situations where that kind of does apply. We don't have guys used to playing off ball, used to cutting, used to screening for each other. And that's actually something where some of the, young Spurs guys have played pretty well, is just that team basketball element of this. But I think that's a lot of it. And we've seen so far defenses use a couple tactics here and there to slow down isolations or slow down post-ups where they're sending extra help. And those are beatable. They're exploitable. But if you're not organized and you're not prepared, it's hard to beat that sort of stuff. And we've seen Team USA get more and more strong at countering those simple little X's and O's things that off the gate, first scrimmage, these games don't even really count. They weren't quite ready to be playing that X's and O's battle. And part of that's on Gregg Popovich, but not in a way that I think it's, substantial criticism that, these games don't mean anything yet. They're getting to play with each other. They're building that chemistry. And I wouldn't jump to early conclusions because I have a pretty strong feeling they'll be able to turn things around. And we're seeing that a little bit already.
Yeah, and that was sort of my next question is do these games really matter? I'm looking at them and I think they're just warm-up games. They're exhibition games. And like you said, these guys aren't used to playing with each other. You look at the last Olympic roster, there are 2 members from that roster. There's Kevin Durant and there's Draymond Green. Everyone else is new. And most of these guys would never play with each other under normal circumstances. And just sort of from a coach's perspective, or really just an analyst's perspective, how important is it that they get familiar with each other? Because you look at these other international teams, like Joe Ingles talked about in the press conference the other day, these guys from Australia, not only have they added NBA caliber players to the roster, but these guys have been together for a decade. The same thing for Argentina. You could say the same thing for Spain and Nigeria. I mean, while maybe they all haven't been together as long, they're familiar with each other. They play FIBA basketball with a pretty consistent roster. How important is that for the United States?
Yeah, it matters. It's hard to quantify exactly how important, but enough so that it is costing this team points each game, and we're still seeing them figure things out. And if we're seeing the same issues a month from now, then then it's time for Stephen A. Smith and whoever to start, calling people out. But right now we're just seeing guys adjust to a different, basketball, a different set of rules, different set of teammates. So it's just part of that learning process. And some of these struggles early on, maybe are just going to make it more worth it down the line.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Now I'll ask you this. For me, Team USA is still the favorite to win gold. Is that your opinion as well?
They have to be. And if they aren't, I see that as a huge gambling opportunity. They should be strongly favored. They've got the guns, and they're going to be adding a few more as well once the finals are over. So I would strongly favor them to win this title.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm right there with you. And like you said, they're going to be getting Drew Holiday. They'll be getting Chris Middleton. They'll be getting Devin Booker. But for the meantime, we have a bunch of select team guys, and one amongst them is Keldon Johnson. So I'd love to get your opinion on Keldon Johnson, his performance from the first couple of scrimmages. I know he hasn't been, a key player. He's not playing a ton of minutes, but what is your evaluation of him in there? And do you think he fits pretty well with this roster so far?
He fits really well. He is one of the few guys on this team that is very, used to and has a good IQ and has been coached well on moving off ball, cutting, and, knowing when to crash for rebounds. He's missed a couple layups. He's gotten some putbacks. He's played some pretty good defense, but just the IQ and I'm like, yeah, this is definitely a Spurs guy. Watching out there with a bunch of other superstars who are dribble, drive, I'm cut off, I'm going to kick it out. Someone else is going to ISO, then someone else will ISO. And then you see Keldon Johnson cut perfectly as the defense is rotating and get a layup. That sort of stuff is much needed on a team full of superstars. You need some of those glue guys. And I think that's what he provides for this sort of group, along with really strong defense.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And specifically, I'm thinking of one play where Bam was sort of backing down the post and people weren't really paying attention to Keldon. He makes that cut. He finishes at the rim. So I do think he sort of adds an interesting dynamic as a player who is used to playing off ball, as a player who's used to really taking pride. And I'm not going to say that the other USA basketball members don't take pride in playing defense, but that's sort of one of Keldon's hallmarks with the Spurs. That's one of the reasons he's earned minutes. I mean, if you're playing for Gregg Popovich and you're not playing defense, you're probably not playing for him, right? You're probably on the bench. So I've liked what I've seen from him. And I've asked Pop this, I've asked Coach Spoelstra this, and I kind of want your opinion too. Do you think that this experience with USA basketball is going to matter to his long-term development? Or do you think this is just sort of an exhibition game? It's just sort of warm up for him. It doesn't really matter in the long, grand scheme of things.
I think every little thing matters, and he has an opportunity, not just in these games, because he's only playing so many minutes out there on the court, but in practices, hanging around with the guys, building that rapport, picking their brains. It's one of those things where you go into an internship and they're like, this can be as much or as little as you want. We need him to be leaning into this experience, picking the brains of guys, challenging them at practice, and trying to learn as much as he can, all those little skills and things that can help him be a better one-on-one player or a better driver, whatever it happens to be, something to see the floor better, see the defense better. That experience, being around this coaching staff, being around those players, I think is certainly value add. Exactly how much so is hard to say, but I would love to see him continue to grow, continue to progress in his career, and have this be something he calls back upon a few years from now.
Yeah, I agree with you here. And I kind of want to move on to talking about San Antonio's young core. It's sort of a polarizing topic, even among the Spurs fan base. But before we really get into the numbers from B-Ball Index or any of the terminology or stuff, I kind of wanted some clarification on the metrics, the terminology. So people will always say, basketball is more than just statistics, right? But statistics, and specifically the statistics that this website provides, B-Ball Index provides, I think are really great because they add context if you were actually watching the games. Now, could you sort of break down a few of these terminologies for me, specifically LeBron, matchup difficulty, defensive versatility, defensive role, offensive archetype? How are those things derived? And just sort of talk about them just for a little bit for me.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I agree with you that a lot of times, the criticism against stats is you can't capture everything in stats. Well, we can capture a lot more now with statistics than we used to be able to a year ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago. And LeBron is one of those things, the matchup difficulty, defensive versatility. These are all leveraging data and math that we just weren't using a couple of years ago. So we'll start with LeBron. It stands for luck adjusted player estimate utilizing a box prior regularized on off, which is a little bit of a mouthful. We call it LeBron instead. And it is like your box plus minus or your real plus minus, or 538 has their metric called Raptor. They're all estimating player impact per 100 possessions on the court compared to a league average player. So if someone's a +2, that means over 100 possessions, you're going to expect to get 2 extra points for your team compared to an average player. And we use box score data for this, but we also use on-off data. And with each of those, we've gotten a little fancy with our math and tried to account for role and account for instances or occurrences in like on-off data that we know are just luck-based. Like if I'm playing against the Spurs and Keldon Johnson shoots 50% on 10 free throws when I'm in the game, but when I'm out of the game, he shoots 100% on 10 free throws. I didn't do anything to make him miss those free throws, but it's going to make me look better than I otherwise would in that on-off data. So adjusting for free throws, adjusting for opposing team 3-point shooting, which is something that like if it's contested more, it's going to go in less. But we know at the individual defender level, they don't have an impact on the team's ability to impact 3-point shooting. So a couple things we have done a bunch of, analysis on, realize that these are just, you're lucky or you're unlucky. And accounting for that helps remove a lot of noise in the data. So we do that with the on-off data. We use RAPM data, regularized adjusted plus minus, which will account for who your teammates are, who the opponents are. So if, you're in a lineup of death and like you do just fine, it's going to be able to recognize that, because when you come out and someone else comes in and the lineup does just as well, they're like, well, maybe Tim wasn't adding all that much. But it looks at every single one of the lineups and it looks at both teams. So luck adjusted using those advanced RAPM calcs on the on-off side. And then on the box score side, we optimize the weighting of different things, points, rebounds, and whatever. And then we also stabilize small samples using the offensive archetypes that we'll talk a little bit about later, where let's say it's the beginning of the season and JaVale McGee and Karl Anthony Towns are both shooting 20% on their 3-pointers. The question that we need to ask this stat is, do we expect both of those players to continue shooting 20% or continue shooting, the league average or the same, average for centers? No, because they have different jobs. Based on how they're used, we know Cat is going to probably shoot better on threes than JaVale McGee, who's barely taking any. So we look at their jobs and we look at the averages for players in those jobs, and we use that to fill in some of the ambiguity on smaller samples. So there's a lot going on with different cool math techniques. It's a lot of best practicing from techniques other people have used in other stats, and it ends up with a pretty accurate, compared to some of its peers, on-off statistic that shines pretty nicely on a few Spurs players.
Yeah, and I try to use it relatively often when I do writing. I really like everything that y'all provide. Now, I sort of want to move on to talking about like defensive roles, sort of like defensive versatility and offensive archetype. How do y'all come to that conclusion? Is that mostly like watching the game and then applying that, or is it like the types of attempts that players are taking, or is it sort of a mix of all that?
Yeah, so you'll see, and like every time we have these like tweets auto scheduled to say, hey, here are our offensive archetypes, people will be like, someone else came up with another way to do this already. Other people, you can come up with a way to categorize players that's based on watching them, but if it's not scalable and you're not able to look at all 530 NBA players at the same time, look at thousands of college players, hundreds of WNBA players, if you can't do it for all of those groups going back a bunch of years, how valuable is what you're able to do? So we leaned on the math, and we are looking at how players are utilized, not just where are your shots. Like a shot chart is very limited in what it tells us about how a player is getting to where they're getting. So instead we look at play type. So like you're isolating or posting up or running a pick and roll into the ball handler, or you're popping or you're cutting, or you're running off of a pin down. Those are all sorts of ways to get to your shots. So we look at that. We'll look at like 3-point attempt rate, drive rates. We estimate how often different players are initiating the offense for a team. We estimate how often their 3-pointers are standing still versus moving. And based off of all of that on offense, we came up with 12 different jobs, 12 different offensive archetypes for players. We have 4 big men roles. So there's roll and cut bigs, your rim runners, your JaVale McGee's, your Jakob Poeltls, your guys that are going to go be the garbage man. We have our post scorers, who are those back to the basket scorers. Nikola Jokic is a great example. Your stretch bigs. So, that I think these are pretty self-explanatory. And then our versatile bigs, who do a bit of the stretch big stuff and also the post scoring. They'll kind of do everything. So those are the big man roles. And then we have on ball guard and wing roles, and then off ball guard and wing roles. For the off ball guards and wings, we have stationary shooters. They kind of evolve. We're talking like Pokemon. They evolve into movement shooters who evolve into off screen shooters. So it goes from I mostly am a shooter, but I stand still, catch and shoot, to I'm a shooter, but I'm able to kind of relocate from the corner to the wing or the wing to the corner, or I drive, I kick it out, and then I'm back up to the 3-pointer, catch and shoot. That kind of movement. It's a different footwork. It requires some different skills, but you're still a shooter. So you're a movement shooter. And then the next evolution is that off-screen shooter where you're coming off of screens, reading the defense and knowing, on a flare screen, if they're trailing me, maybe I curl versus maybe I fade if they're going under, those sorts of things. And then athletic finishers are those off-ball. They're going to get their putbacks. They're going to cut. They're not really ball handlers, and they're also not really shooters. They do their work, their dirty work on the inside. And then we have our on ball guards and wings, secondary ball handlers, primary ball handlers, slashers who are, the ball's in their hand a lot, but they're not really 3-point shooters, more like a De'Aaron Fox. He likes to get to the rim. And then our shot creators, which is 80% of the Team USA roster. Those guys that are, you're going to get the ball to them, let them go ISO. We've analyzed like how much scheme and optimization of rosters matters for these different roles. Shot creators are shot creators. It doesn't really matter what scheme you're running. If they're able to do their thing, they're doing pretty well. So those are some of the roles on offense. We do similar stuff on defense, looking at the types of players you defend using these archetypes, using matchup data, looking at where you're defending shots, defensive activity, stuff like that. And we're able to see if someone's like a point of attack defender or a wing stopper, you're defending scoring wings, or I don't want to I'm getting super in the weeds.
Sure, yeah.
So I'll raise it up a little bit, but we have some really cool 7 different defensive roles as well. And then the matchup difficulty and defensive versatility stats look at partial possession matchup data. So we could say for this possession, Tim defended that guy for 30% of the time, that guy for 20% of the time, that guy for 50% of the time. So we look at, if you're switching, if you're helping, whatever it happens to be. And then from that, looking at all the players you're guarding, what is like the average usage and the average offensive impact of that player. And we throw that all together and come up with the average matchup difficulty that you're taking on. So if you're guarding guys who never touch the ball and aren't impactful, you are probably taking on easier matchups than someone who is chasing around dudes who always have the ball in their hands and are really helpful for the opposing team offense. And then versatility looks at point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward, center. What's that breakdown look like? A perfectly versatile defender would be guarding all 5 of those 20% of the time. A perfectly unversatile defender would be guarding one of them 100% of the time. We look at the breakdown for each player, and then the math basically looks at how far away are they from being that perfect versatile defender. So it's not, you're the most capable. It's just another way to look at what your job is. So with role, with versatility, with difficulty, these are all context-based stats that we then can apply with the defensive component of our LeBron metric and tell us, he's impactful or he's not impactful. Maybe 2 players have the same defensive impact, but one of them is taking on really tough matchups and the other one is completely hiding on defense. And with these sorts of stats, we're able to dig a little bit deeper, have some more context, and really talk basketball with the numbers the way we'd like to talk basketball at a bar or with your teammates or watching at home with your friends.
Yeah, thank you so much for really breaking that down for us. And I just wanted to get your sort of breakdown on it so that people at home who are not familiar with the terminology or how you sort of come to these stats can understand it a little bit better. Now, I want to talk about some of the stats in relation to specific players on this team, and specifically some of the members of the young core. We'll call them young core. Some of them are older than others. Like, Derek White's 27. DeJounte is going to be 25 soon, but generally Spurs fans consider them to be part of the young core. So we'll go ahead and talk about them in that context. Now, when we look at DeJounte Murray, the things that stand out for me is that he has one of the highest matchup difficulties on defense, and that his defensive versatility, it's not super high, but that he's pretty effective in what he does. What do you think some of these numbers tell us about DeJounte as a defender, and maybe as DeJounte as sort of a secondary creator, if you want to call him that?
Yeah, they tell us he's really good. He is a point of attack defender by our defensive roles. He's taking on that lead ball handler. And generally we see high matchup difficulty with those sorts of defenders, but even among them, he's really, really high. He has an A grade there. A- versatility is still very, very good, especially for a guy in that role. And we see that translate to an A grade defensive impact. And with all of our numbers, we have the number itself. We translate that to a percentile, the percentage of the league you're higher than, and then a letter grade, A, B, C, D, F, with minuses and pluses and everything. So he is really good and at a very, very difficult job. So as a defensive player, he's just about everything you would want to ask for. On the offensive end, he still has a pretty high impact, A- grade there, 93rd percentile overall impact, and his role offensively is as a slasher. So he's one of those on-ball guys trying to get to the rim. And if we dig a little bit deeper into some of our other statistics that analyze his different tendencies and skills, he is a pretty darn good guy at getting to the rim and then also finishing at the rim. The 3-point shot needs to be a little bit better, but the playmaking is there. It's not elite, but it's very good. And he just flashes a bunch of potential as a young guard in this league.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. I really like DeJounte. Now, let's move on to Derek White. Looking at the numbers, do you think that it sort of suggests that he's a good complement to DeJounte Murray? Do you think he can be that? And I'm sort of speaking in terms of if DeMar DeRozan is gone next season, because there's a very strong chance that, he walks for nothing this offseason, or they maybe try to do a sign and trade. And that's one of the combinations that Spurs fans want to see, right? Like a few years ago when they were finally both healthy, they only played about 200 minutes together. This season, we saw them play a little bit more, but Derek White was hurt. Do you think that they say that they can complement each other? And what do they say really about Derek White in general?
Yeah, so his jobs are offensively as a secondary ball handler, which meshes just fine with a slasher like Murray. Defensively, he's a wing stopper. So he's, DeJounte's going to take the other team's probably point guard, and Derek White can go take their small forward, their Kawhis, their LeBrons, their whoever's going to be, that ISO scorer, their Jason Tatums. And he's been taking on pretty high difficulty, pretty high versatility, really good defensive impact, a B+ there, in a very difficult job. And offensively, I think the thing for me when looking at the Spurs young players is they're pretty similar in that they get to the rim well, they finish at the rim well, they don't space the floor. So when you're looking at roster construction, we talked earlier with Team USA about having a bunch of shot creators. The Spurs have a bunch of guys that get to the rim. They don't have a lot of guys that are going to, away from the ball, pull the defense away from the rim to open up some of those driving lanes. So I think you can certainly have multiple players of this, in these roles with these skill sets on the court at the same time, and you can build together like that. But the complementary pieces around them would, in a focus of mine going into this offseason, would be to add some shooting. If you're going to replace your DeMar DeRozans and some of the other older players on the roster with other players, add some shooting so that these guys who like to get to the rim and are already very good at it can do so with more space. So together, I think the two of them are fine, but you want to have the pieces around them complement those skill sets.
Yeah, no, that's a great explanation there. And let's talk about Lonnie Walker. So he's sort of a guy who people have been hoping would be the shooter for this team. I mean, obviously he has some other skills. He can put the ball on the floor a little bit. He can create his own offense a little bit. I think he could potentially down the road be a sort of a 3-level scorer, but to this point, we haven't seen it. He hasn't finished well at the rim. He's not a great percentage from 3, about league average, and in the mid-range, it doesn't look good on decent volume. And one of the things that stands out to me when I'm looking at these numbers is his defensive versatility is pretty low. His matchup difficulty is pretty high, but his LeBron was awful. He finished 530th out of, I think, 550 so players. What do you think about Lonnie Walker? Like, are you confident he's somebody who the Spurs could potentially build around going forward, or what are your thoughts on him generally? Because I'm sort of at a loss for what to expect from him at this point.
From an outsider perspective and without watching him every day, but just seeing the numbers, I wouldn't say it's the most promising. I think his shooting is a good complement to the players he's around, but like you mentioned, not the best from a finishing standpoint. The playmaking isn't really there, and for a guard, you'd want some playmaking. His job in offense has been as a movement shooter, just kind of out of the way, a secondary creator if he needs to, but more a complementary piece. I think with as low an impact as he has, you'd want to see him placed into a role defensively that better, is a little bit scaled down. It's hard to ask a guy who's not as good defensively to take on matchups more difficult than 88% of players in the NBA, which is what they're doing. or be more versatile than 79% of players in the NBA, which is what they're doing. So maybe ask a little bit less, scale a little bit down, and you'll see him be a little bit less exposed on defense, if that's the way you want to word it. So I think there are ways to have a better impact with the skill set he has currently. His shooting isn't fantastic, and a lot of the other offensive skills aren't flashing super high potential. So I don't know if he would be a piece I'd say I'd build around, but if he can improve the shooting and be an off-ball complementary piece to some of these other guys that like to get to the rim, I think you can, continue to have him on the roster and make more of him. And he's only 22, 23. So there's still some time.
Yeah, he's pretty young. And I also want to ask you this question. So do you think you haven't seen every Spurs game, and I don't expect you to. They weren't a winning team. They didn't make the playoffs. They were in the play-in. Do you think it's more of he's a bad defender, or do you think it is really that he's been given such a tough assignment? Because it sounds like he was given some really difficult assignments. Like off the top of my head, I'm thinking, he guarded Jaylen Brown, he guarded Jason Tatum, he guarded Kawhi Leonard, he guarded Bradley Beal. Those are all NBA level guys. Like that seems like a really tough thing to ask of him. Do you think if he is moved to a lesser role or asked to do less, do you genuinely believe that he's going to be someone who can maybe flash more serviceability than he has been? Because there's a lot of Spurs fans and writers who say, this guy's just awful at defense. And I'm just not sure that's 100% the case.
It's hard to tell. I certainly think the impact would be less negative, but I wouldn't expect somebody who has an impact defensively lower than 99% of NBA players to suddenly jump to average or above average. But if you could take him from like an F to a D+, that can really help your defense potentially. So I think there's some room to optimize what he is, but I wouldn't call him a good defender or somebody that's flashing defensive potential.
I think that's fair. That's fair. And I want to ask you about, like, just in general with this young core, they've got DeJounte Murray, Derek White, Lonnie Walker, Keldon Johnson, Devin Vassell. Would you be confident in saying that any of these guys can become that alpha? And really with DeMar DeRozan there and Rudy Gay there and Patty Mills, they ate a lot of touches. They had a lot of minutes. How much do you think that would factor into that next year if they are given the reins?
I think the guy who has the best chance would be DeJounte Murray. If he can develop a more consistent three-point shot, that's the thing keeping him from being an absolute stud. He already is a super impactful player defensively, lights out, difficulty, versatility, impact, all of that stuff. He does it at a really tough, very valuable position on defense. Offensively, he's very, very good at a number of really key skills, especially skills for his role. He's just got to be able to shoot a little bit better from three. And if so, that helps unlock things for him, because if he's somebody that you can go under ball screens against, that makes it harder for him to be good at what he's good at. He's like a really good young pitcher in baseball that has one really good pitch. And you have to be able to develop those other pitches, because if they know what's coming, it's easier to prepare against it and be impactful against it. So if he can develop that changeup and that curveball, his fastball is going to be even better than it is today. So that's the next step for him. And given his age, I don't know that it's realistic to expect him to suddenly become an elite three-point shooter, especially pull-up shooter, in the way that it would manipulate defensive ball screen coverages. But I would say he's the one that's closest to being able to do that. And I think in general, with Derek White, that's another guy that I feel pretty good about him being able to develop into a pretty good scorer. With more touches, he's going to get more attention. And with San Antonio, they don't seem to get that national attention you'd love to see, despite having tons and tons of people in the area. But I feel pretty good about those two as being two of my top three players, I'd say, on like a team that's able to eventually contend. If they can develop, add some help eventually, I feel good about having them somewhere in that mix.
Yeah, and I look at the roster and I think I'm not necessarily saying they are like one piece away or two pieces away, but it does seem like if they had that superstar, they'd be a lot better. Obviously that would be the case for all of the league, right? You get the superstar and then everything else sort of falls into place some of the time. Like you look at the Mavericks, they have Luka, they've got Kristaps, who didn't really live up to expectations this year, but the rest of the roster maybe is not optimized for you to win a championship. Where I think you look at the Spurs roster, if you add that superstar, they sort of look like a very competitive roster that could compete, but they don't have that guy. One of the last couple of guys who I want to go over with you, and we don't have to spend too much time on them, but Luka Šamanić, Trey Jones, and Jakob Poeltl. What are your opinions of them? I really like Jakob. I think he's really impactful for his role. But Trey Jones is a question mark to me. He's not shooting threes. He didn't get a ton of minutes in the NBA, but he looks solid in the G League. And then Luka Šamanić really just hasn't done much of anything. Granted, he hasn't gotten much opportunity.
Yeah, so when they don't have a lot of opportunity, it's hard for a data guy like me to draw too many conclusions. But I can say that Tre Jones, decent driver, he's been a poor pick and roll scorer. He's not really a shooting threat at all, it appears, from perimeter. So it's one thing to not be great, but still, get him up. When you're not even putting those shots up and you have just no gravity, you're not able to draw those defenders out. That is the type of guard that you can't really play with the type of slashing offensive players that the Spurs are building around. So that is a huge red flag to me. He's not a good defender. He's had a pretty large negative impact. So I'm fairly low on Tre Jones. Šamanić, he gets to the rim pretty well, finishes well, rebounds well, but he's not, a passer, roll man. He's not a shooter. He's not a one-on-one player. He's inefficient in a lot of areas. So he can do some things well, but he's got to add another couple NBA skills to be a little bit more impactful. And then Jakob Poeltl, he's very good for what he does. I mean, 98th percentile defensive impact. He's an elite rim protector. He's maybe chasing some blocks at times, and because of that, not defensively rebounding as well as you'd like to see, but he's scoring at the rim pretty well. We have badges at B-Ball Index, the way that like 2K has badges.
Yeah.
He has a gold rim protector badge. He has a gold contact finisher badge, and he has a silver offensive rebound hunter badge. So he's getting some extra possessions. He's finishing through contact, and he's defending the rim. And for a roll and cut big, that is the kind of, play that can, plug him into a team that's ready to contend. And that's someone that's, going to be able to do a really good job. I think you just need to add some of the dynamic pick and roll ball handling around him, guys that can, hit those pull-ups and draw two defenders in coverages instead of just being able to drop back and stay and play that lob. That will help open up more scoring opportunities for him in the future.
Definitely. And with all the things that we've talked about in mind, I want to go ahead and kind of close things out by talking about the Spurs' long-term future, sort of starting with, they have $50 million in cap space this offseason. How do you think they should approach free agency with sort of a weaker crop of talent available? And, what are some of the players that they should be targeting? Like, what kind of players should they be targeting to improve this roster?
I'm really glad you asked, because something I've done over the past 15 days is we've picked, so I have my own podcast. We have our own Discord server, and we've done a thing where we pick 2 NBA teams a day, and we're going to go through, like, what is our plan for this offseason? From our players, who are we keeping? What's our general strategy? Who might we go after? And the Spurs were one of the first teams that we went to. And what we came to the conclusion for was our general goal or approach was to kind of turn the page from some of those older, expensive players and use our cap space, build around our young guards. We know what they're good at, build a roster with complementary pieces, and be a team that can go into this free agency knowing that you can take some swings at restricted free agents, knowing that even if you don't get them, you're not chasing a title this year anyway, and you can kind of punt that space towards next offseason. But you're one of the few teams in a position that you have the space and you have some of the young players that you could just go take a shot. Go take a shot at Alonzo Ball. Go take a shot at a Gary Trent Jr. or a John Collins. There are players out there that might be gettable if you go to the right price. And if you can add a couple of those rising young players in with this current crop of guys, that can jumpstart this rebuilding process that I think you'd be looking to move into this year. So, renounce your DeRozan, your Rudy Gay, Patty Mills, Lyles. I think Bellinelli's still on the books. Cunningham, waive Jeffries, pick up Eubanks's team option. I think you'd want to bring bring Gorgui Dieng back. I'm assuming, since they picked him up as a non-competing team last year, but as a buyout guy, they have some plans for him. So we'll say he comes back. And then you've got like $49 million in space or something like that. And then the room exception, a couple picks. So I think for ball handlers, I'd target Cameron Payne, who can shoot pretty well. He gets to the rim well. Phoenix is limited in what they're able to offer him. They can only really offer him about like a 3-year, $40 million deal. Or I'm sorry, they can offer him about $10.5 million a year. So if you offer him like a 340, that's more than he's getting by staying. If you offer him more than that, he's certainly gettable. Lonzo Ball is a guy on a team that we're seeing publicly is very feeling a lot of angst about paying $20 million to keep him or $18 million to keep him. So I'd inquire there. Gary Trent Jr. on another team that may not want to pay more than 15, 16 mil to bring him back. Maybe you look at Duncan Robinson, although I think Miami would match whatever. And then from a big man standpoint, I think Bobby Portis is a very obtainable guy that Milwaukee just can't afford to bring him back. They don't have the money. They can't really give him any sort of raise. So he's going to go to a different team, and you are one of the teams that can go after him. And I think he fits well with the other players on the roster. And then John Collins is a very, very good young big man that I think would also fit the roster and may also be obtainable. I'd say guys like Dinwiddie, Otto Porter Jr., Tim Hardaway Jr., Fournier, they don't really match the timeline. So I leave them to other teams, let other teams that have cap space chew up that space on them. I'd focus more on these younger guys generally that better match the timeline. So if I had to pick, I'd say go offer Cameron Payne, go offer Bobby Portis, and then one of Collins or Trent, one of those restricted free agents, and see if you can really build onto this young core and be in a pretty good position moving into this next season to have like a really fun young team.
Yeah. And it's actually really interesting. Spurs fans are obsessed with John Collins right now. They love John Collins. I like him. I think he fits well for the team. And I sort of want your opinion on this. Pretty much everyone who's hopped on the podcast has talked about John Collins, at least for a little bit. My concern with John Collins, and I'm totally open to having my concerns, thrown out the window. But my concern with John Collins is that the majority of his offense is created by other players, right? 80% of his baskets, or nearly 80% of his baskets, were assisted. He was a guy who had superior spacing in Atlanta. If he comes to San Antonio, do you have any concerns that, he's asked to do more, and he's asked to do more in a system that really isn't as beneficial for him? So there you see his efficiency sort of drop, even if his per game numbers may go up.
I think that's a fair concern, and it certainly matches with what the data is saying. But I see him as a guy that, like, as a pick and popper, he complements what you'd want to do with your star players well, or your top players well. He has a little bit of that one-on-one game. I mean, his if you add up his post ups and his isolation possessions per 100 possessions on the court together, he's isolating more than 80% of players in the NBA. It's not super high levels, but it's not nothing. So there's something there. And on those possessions, he has an A- effective field goal percentage, A- impact overall when you look at the volume and the efficiency. So there's some pulse there with that, more than a lot of players. And I think adding that in to the group of guys you have already, and adding in someone who's as strong a role man, as strong a defensive player, or I'm sorry, not an offensive finisher at the rim, I see it being a fit. I do agree that he'd be more a finisher than a creator, but I think how you use him in actions as a guy who can roll to the rim or as a guy that can pop helps complement some of those other pieces that optimized well and running the right plays, using the right actions. I still think it's a pretty good fit. But if you're really concerned about making sure you go get a guy who's going to create a little bit more, he might not be my top pick. And there might not be that guy this offseason.
Yeah, and I don't think that there's really anybody this offseason, at least who fits that sort of positional size need for the Spurs. And one of the other guys who I'll throw out to you real quick, Lauri Markkanen. To me, I would avoid him if I'm the Spurs. I don't think he makes a lot of sense for them. What do you think of him? Do you think he would be a good fit for the Spurs? Do you think he makes enough impact to make them even a playoff team in the West next season?
I wouldn't. So I will have. There are a lot of moving parts, and I don't know what else would happen with other pieces of the roster. But I wouldn't take like this roster, add Markkanen, and expect that to be a huge unlocking piece that helps you jump. He's a very good shooter. He's likely going to be renounced by Chicago. They're going to probably let him walk, and he's really good at what he's good at. He's just not good in plenty of other areas. But I see plenty of potential, and I see enough skill areas that he's pretty strong in. Like, he's a good off-screen player, good off-screen shooter, pretty good cutter. He is pretty good at finishing at the rim, although he's not really creating for himself at the rim. He's a very good three-point shooter. He doesn't isolate a ton, but when he does, he's done a decent job. And on the defensive boards, he does a pretty good job. So there's plenty that you can have concerns about, but I do think that I'm interested to see where he lands this offseason, because I think there's something there. There's talent there that, if harnessed and put in the right environment, you could make a little bit more out of. And I'm not sure if the Spurs are that fit, but he would certainly be a floor spacer that would complement, 3 or 4 more core pieces we've talked about today that aren't really floor spacers. So he could be one of those guys that, just from a fit standpoint, makes some sense.
And just between Collins and Markkanen, is it Collins over Markkanen for sure by a wide margin,
Oh,
or is it close?
absolutely.
Okay.
Oh, no, by a lot. Markkanen is somebody that if you don't end up nailing any of those other bigger names, you're not able to go, grab someone who you feel pretty confident can have a strong impact. He's somebody that I would go into the offseason looking to just kind of like grab as a reclamation project and put in a better environment, put in a better situation with better sets, better coaching, and be able to make more out of him, because he's worth more than his market value is going to be. Like he's a better player than he's shown. And if a team with cap space can just go pay, $6 million a year instead of the 5-year taxpayer MLE or whatever it takes to go grab him, that you can get plenty of surplus value on that. And as a team rebuilding like the Spurs, and with any team that wants to end up competing, you have to have those guys that are able to provide more value than you're paying for them. And he's someone that could get there and might be like a buy low, sell high in the future, or cash in high in a couple of years.
Yeah. And I agree with you there. And I think I'm really appreciative that you kind of broke that down for me. Now, one of the other topics that has been like really big for Spurs fans is Ben Simmons. Now, there really hasn't been any buzz that they're going to acquire Ben Simmons. But if a player like that is available and the Spurs think they can get him for, say, a DeMar DeRozan and a couple of first-round picks, is that a player that they should look to acquire? I know that, we talked about fit in terms of a guy who probably needs to be surrounded by shooters. San Antonio is not that place right now. But is he someone who, if he's available, that they have to go after? Or do you think, just continue to build with what you got and see what you get in free agency?
I mean, if he's cheap enough that you can pay DeMar DeRozan, who I think the Spurs will move on from anyway, and then a couple firsts, I would do that. But I strongly believe that this is not close to the top situations to make the most out of Ben Simmons. Like with him, you want to have him partnered with a dynamic pick and roll ball handler that's going to be a good enough 3-point shooter that he's drawing multiple defenders. Your big man can't play drop coverage. They have to really come up aggressively and either trap or show him recover, or like a soft hedge, something that puts 2 defenders on the ball in a way that creates those short roll opportunities that we've seen a guy like Draymond Green be so good at. And we've seen guys like Hassan Whiteside, Yusuf Nurkic last playoffs, not this one, against the Lakers be so bad at. It's that short roll. It can be so valuable. And that is the type of skill set that not too many bigs have, or not too many players that could be a screen and roll kind of guy have. If Simmons is partnered with DeJounte Murray and they're just going under his ball screens, he's never getting any of those short rolls. So it's just one of those, if you're going to unlock Ben Simmons and make him the most he can be, San Antonio with their current roster is not the place to do that. I would so much rather see him go to be partnered with a Dame Lillard, or, I don't think he's going to be able to make his way to Dallas, but Luka or Trae Young, or one of those guys that draws those 2 defenders. Because then if he's good enough in those 4v3 short rolls, then you can't send those 2 defenders against those ball handlers and the ball screens. And as a defense, you're just stuck. If you can't trap Dame Lillard and you're giving up those pull-up threes, you're in trouble. And if you send 2 guys and that opens the 4v3 short roll and Ben Simmons is able to, wheel and deal as he's driving at the rim, there's really no win there. So that is why Draymond Green has been so successful with Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, and just kind of the type of route I would want to be taking with the Ben Simmons, and the Spurs just aren't that place.
Yeah, I can firmly say that I wasn't expecting you to say much else besides that. I just was curious about what you might say when I threw that out there. I don't really think Ben Simmons makes a lot of sense for San Antonio, but I'll sort of close on this. What do you feel is the best direction for this franchise if they really want to establish themselves, back in that sort of contender stratosphere?
I think you need to set. So the first thing is they need to figure out if their core pieces are going to be their core pieces. And if so, what they're good at is getting to the rim, and you've got some good defenders, and you need to throw some self-creation and some shooting around that. And we've brought up a couple players today that kind of fit the bill there, but that would be those general kinds of skill sets would be what I would be targeting. Like, how do we build a cohesive group of roles and skill sets and players that, put all together, they're able to be more than just those separate components. So you're really looking for that fit. And I think you have to be a team that turns the page from some of these older players that aren't going to be part of the future and jump on opportunities, be one of those few key players with money this offseason, and go see if you can get, a Josh Hart for $8 million a year if the Pelicans aren't going to match that. Like, go find values because the market right now has a lot of players with these teams that only have their exceptions to use. So, X amount of teams have the taxpayer MLE. They can only offer $5 million a year. If we offer $7 million a year, it's not a crazy amount of money, but we know we can just barely beat it. It's like playing like Price is Right. If you go, just one over them, everything above it counts for you. So in reality, the price might be higher, but if you're the closest bidder, you might still, win that Price is Right. So that is kind of my general approach. You can punt the cap space if you don't find good deals, but go hunting for those bargains, because if you make enough of those good moves and you add on to what you have and these guys continue to grow, that is how you build a championship contender.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for really giving me your insight there. Spurs fans have heard me talk about this team a bunch, probably more than they want to hear. And I'm glad that I got a sort of analytical approach to this. And I do appreciate you hopping on here with me. And before I let you go, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to sort of plug anything that you're working on. Let Spurs fans know where they can find you on social media and where they can find your content.
Yeah, of course. So I don't think you're going to want to follow any of my Lakers stuff. So don't follow my podcast. But you can follow me on Twitter at Tim_NBA. I talk a lot of general NBA stuff as well as the Lakers, of course. My website is Basketball Index, B-Ball Index. It's the_B-Ball_Index on Twitter. On there, you can find all sorts of stats that are all contextualized. They all have these letter grades, percentiles, color coding, lots of interactive tools. We are really leaning into the idea that like players are more than their efficiency, and there's more to basketball than just these boring stats that only look at if the ball went in or out. There's so much more context to the game. And we approach that with like our matchup difficulty, our positional versatility, the impact metrics we use, our talent grades, which we didn't really talk about today, where we look at not just if you're good or bad at something, but are you good or bad at it? And then how do we account for your volume and like the context around you? Is Rudy Gobert standing behind you and that makes you a better defender? Look like a better defender than you are. Little context things like that to evaluate your true talent as a perimeter shooter or a finisher or a playmaker. These are the sorts of things that we look to quantify and we have available on our site. A lot of it's for free. There are 20 different free pages on the site, but then we also have our data and tools package, which is just $5 a month. And you get to see all sorts of different things. Our player profiles have every player since 2013, 2014, all the way through now in the NBA. So that's like thousands of players. And for each guy, you have like 240, 250 different stats, everything you could want to know about a guy's tendencies, skill sets, proficiency, efficiency, impact, whatever it might be, those badges, their jobs, their roles, all of that in one place. You can close the other 14 tabs you have trying to pull up every stat you can on DeJounte Murray. We have it in one place. So go check that out over at B-Ball Index.
I strongly endorse paying that $5 subscription fee. I do it, and they have so many tools that make it more than worth the money. So thanks again, Tim, for joining me, and thanks to everyone who tuned in for this edition of Alamo City Limits. And for those of you listening at home, make sure to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We've got a fantastic staff of writers over at Pounding the Rock who do an amazing job of keeping everyone up to date with their favorite team. So check our stuff out. But until next time, take care, Spurs fans.